good to talk with a lot of news happening earlier today. Big impact for Vietnam and the world.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting day. Catching up, talking to some trade policy people and some different economists I work with, and getting their views on it all. And a couple of clients that were a bit uncomfortable, but no, it's been interesting.
The word interesting, not one that's come up a lot with people I've talked to. Damaging is one that more comes to mind more than anything else.
Yeah, I don't see that. This is this is not the end. You know, it's the beginning of a new trade system, however you want to look at it. The past system, America set up and dominated for 90 years. This is a new one.
And look, admittedly, US has not been part of the multilateral system for a long time now, so the rest of the world has been, and it's just gone its own way, and now it's doing its own thing again. I think there's a lot of trust that it's damaging in the process, but you're right, it's not that it's been invested in the multilateral system that we've seen in recent years anyway.
Yeah, and I think it's just begun, and it's new, and let's see where it goes. And there's a lot to talk about, but there's more to come. So we have to wait for the retaliation from other countries, see how that impacts things, how that impacts demand and supply around the world. 60 countries have been affected more than others. So you have the blanket 10% that goes across everyone. Outside of that, there's 60. Yes, Vietnam got hit with number 2 at the moment, but there's a Vietnamese delegation over there that have met before this, that are there now and to meet. And luckily for Vietnam, in that sense, the American authorities are meeting the Vietnamese side. They're not one of the countries that they're not talking to, right?
Okay, so let's break into a few parts. One, we've got the immediate potential impact, the retaliation and potential global impact. Another one is what this is trying to achieve and where we may get to. So let's look at the short-term impact. So if nothing else happened, if this was just the result, and as we'll get to what will likely happen, is to say there's negotiations, we're looking at a quite recessive element to this, where it's going to increase prices in the US, it's going to decrease consumption, it's going to have an impact on exporting economies. Vietnam is one of those which has an impact because it is an export-dependent economy. So that by itself is not good, which is why the immediate reactions exist. Now, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but we'll see the European countries and some of the North Asians will do retaliatory because they can afford it. They're not as export-dependent and they have the capacity to do it. A lot of the Southeast Asians and the developing countries don't have the capacity to put extra costs on their local economy by doing retaliatory tariffs. Is that a fair call of what we're probably going to see, the short-term reactions?
Yeah, and this is where Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy has been really good. So I referred back to, they've got FTAs and multilateral agreements around the world. They've got strategic comprehensive agreements around the world. They're a part of every major trade bloc. And some of those trade blocs haven't really even begun. So they've signed up to be within groups of trading nations, to be partners of nations. And because of the demand from the American market, there hasn't been a need to really push deeper into those, but they're a part of them. Now there's a need. And when you look at developed countries kicking back, like the EU or Canada and so forth, that's fine for Vietnam too, because ASEAN is a part of all the supply chains. So ASEAN don't need to get too involved in that sense. They need to show what they need to show, but they don't need to get their gloves on, so to speak. One, because they'll lose, and two, they don't need to. There's other people that have more at stake.
And it's interesting if China retaliates in an unanticipated way and puts blocks or export restrictions and not necessarily with financial controls, because the economy can absorb that. Exports are a much smaller part of the economy. So there's interesting things, and this is where the unknown, because what the Trump administration's policy is a gamble. He is taking a gamble. And we're yet to see what that gamble means. We'll talk about what the long-term aim is, but the gamble, it's going to be interesting of what that means in other countries and what they do. But Vietnam, as you say, is unlikely to take a rash public reaction. We've seen that limited commentary in the press in Vietnam, and it's very much the bamboo diplomacy is the choice. So the reactions, the short-term reactions. Now, given you touched on there, China is an integral part of supply chain. The global supply chain. It is the foundation of the global supply chain. What impact short term do you think it will have, given that China actually effectively has a 25 plus 34, a 59% tariff on them now from what they were a few months ago? What's the effect of Vietnam and the global effect just in the short term?
Well, in the very, very short term, Vietnam, ASEAN, and a lot of countries in the world need to be very fearful of China dumping a lot of cheap products that can be supplied from their domestic companies. Yeah, China will have all this inventory. They've got all this production capacity. It needs to go somewhere. So in the short term, everyone should expect that, and that's going to hurt domestic markets and companies that are involved supplying their own consumers, so to speak. So the SMEs and things like that. That in the short term, that's definitely on the cards. But reverse that in the other short term, and I mentioned this last time we spoke last week, supply chains into China are going to open up. Once China fight back with tariffs, that closes out America, and China still needs goods, yeah? And some of those come from America, were processed directly into China to go to other markets or for Chinese consumption. Vietnam can become the processing hub for that. Yeah. Now, that doesn't fix everything, but it's an illustration of how things adjust based on one country retaliating. When we've got the EU and Canada in blocks retaliating, there's a lot that can go down.
So let's look at Vietnam specifically. What's going to happen to Vietnam's manufacturing, export-focused economy where 30% of exports go to the US? Do you see decisions being made quickly by buyers and recipients in the US to cut back, or are they going to suck it up, or is it going to be a balance, or are we going to have to wait and see what that means from trade volumes? Do you think there's going to be any immediate impact, or it is a wait and see?
Well, some of the bigger companies already have supply contracts in place that have been financed upon, and they'll have to continue for a certain duration. Yeah, but I laugh a little bit. So if a pair of sneakers gets taxed 50%, like Vietnam 46%, or it gets taxed, 24% coming out of Indonesia, at the American end, demand falls, consumption falls. 46%, 25%, either one impacts demand severely. So I'm not getting caught up in the percentage too much, if that makes sense, for some sectors, right?
So demand's going to fall, and
no matter what.
And sorry for cutting in. That supply chains take a long time to change. You can't just find alternate suppliers, do testing, get certification, go through that in a short period of time. You can't build a factory in a short period of time. So will we just see demand fall and the markets just suck up the current process?
Oh, well, I would have imagined companies with good financial management would already have contingency plans for this and have already planned for it, yeah? It impacts the ones that haven't. The ones that have been enjoying the golden goose, which is the American consumers, right? And have only focused on the American market. And quite frankly, maybe you've been enjoying it for long enough. And you can understand why America has had to do something, yeah? But other companies' contingency plans should have started before COVID. COVID should have been a wake-up that you need more than one major market. And if people are still going again and again, well, things just need to realign.
So let's look at the longer term, what's going to play out here in the negotiations. So I was reading that sort of one of the views from the administration, or those connected close to the administration, says that these tariffs are actually just a tool to dismantle the levies imposed by other countries, and it's to stop other countries from deploying trade barriers, subsidised product, and they're committing IP theft. So they see it as a negotiating tool to break down barriers. Is that what it is? Is this the start of negotiations?
Yeah, well, that's what it's there for, yeah, to get people to the table in a losing position, right? And well, we go back to Vietnam again. So Vietnam's got money. They don't have debt issues. We spoke about this last week, yeah? They have 34% of their GDP to debt, yeah? So they've got money. Philippines quite recently bought some defense equipment and jets from America. You don't need to buy a lot to remove that surplus very, very quickly. So Vietnam can lower tariffs with some agricultural products, food products that are not grown here, that come from other markets. They can come into the market when we look at pork, chicken, fruits. Yeah? Defense equipment, they can do that.
But
energy, ethanol, gas, these are all things the country needs.
But what they need, governments can dictate spending. It's very hard to get the private sector to force them to buy US goods or any country goods. So I just question, I come back to this, the jets are one thing, the planes, those sort of things are something the government can control in a shorter term and can do a deal and much easier. I just think that forcing domestic consumption is always going to be a harder game.
Yeah, but I would refer back to, this is Vietnam. This is not a developed market. So a few years ago, Vietnam needed to fix up a surplus issue. They had some problems with the swine flu that was going through. Overnight, 3 Vietnamese companies went to America and bought $400 million worth of pork supply for a year. Yeah. If the government asked some of the big companies to do this and can make it viable for those companies, they will do it. It's a country that get behind each other. Yeah. When the times are like this, they become one. Yeah.
Will this gamble backfire? Is it, because just on that, it's interesting. Another comment I saw was that like the EU and China and Japan are looking to do respond and do tariff response. Is this just circular Russian roulette? No one's going to win if you start fighting. Vietnam's not going to do that. But do you think this gamble is going to play out generally, or from the US?
Well, what with that? Vietnam will let countries do that. They'll work with everyone. They have FTAs with everyone. They are open for everyone. So they'll let these countries make their own decisions, do what they want. And Vietnam will find opportunities within that, and countries will want to work with them because of their attitude and because of how they've set up how they do international business.
Yeah.
So
the whole rate they're applying to all the countries in Vietnam and other countries, it's surplus targeting. This is not trade barriers. This is not reciprocal tariffs against there. It's simply the whole formula, that 90%, which led to 46 for Vietnam, is simply surplus targeting. That's all it is. And that by itself indicates where the solution is. Decrease the surplus. Am I simplifying it too much?
No, and I think the one thing that is spoken about, but not deep enough, I think, is how this is going to shift alliances and friendships. So I call them trade blocks, yeah? And it's already begun, and it's going to accelerate that, yeah? And Vietnam is a part of all of them. So it is going to hurt America and any American that's involved, that studies policy, that studies economics. They're the most upset people in the world about this, because they know the damages it's going to have. So whatever we're feeling is nothing compared to what Americans are feeling.
Yeah, the underlying trade partner, the isolationist approach there, where you're right. If the EU and BRICS come together, that represents most of the world, and then you've got Vietnam and other countries with the EU trade agreements and very close to many of the BRICS members and have reciprocal agreements. it starts bringing. You're right. It's the world against the US, and that's where my reservation about if this is going to be an easy solution is if it's a ganging up against the US. The US is the most dominant trading entity in its own right, but if you get all those others together, so this realignment, is it going to work the way is the gamble going to work, or is it going to be sustained pain unnecessarily for the world because the gamble didn't pay off? And that's what I'm interested to see of how that plays out. And then back domestically, where Vietnam will sit more passively, how long can we sit on the sidelines and just see what's happening from a foreign investment perspective and from a sustainability? I agree that Vietnam has deep pockets comparative to other countries when it comes to national debt, but it still is a developing country with its own risks and concerns. So it's too many layers of depth here for me to really get my head around, but there's a lot of things in play.
Yeah, well, I guess FDI doesn't leave overnight, so the companies that are here still have to wait and see what happens with these trade blocks, with the retaliation. There is no answer yet, so they're going to have to wait. Yeah, FDI that's coming into Vietnam. Well, as you and I know, companies plan this a long time in advance. So they've made their decision. Maybe this will delay their final decision. They'll wait and see. Yeah, but it's not going to crumble overnight. It's more about. I'm more concerned for domestic companies with poor fiscal management. They're the ones I'm worried about, that have relied purely on the US market. And I said, have done really well, or off the golden egg, or whatever you want to call it. They're the ones I'm worried about.
They don't have the margins, and I agree, because if you look at the trade figures, you've got trade surplus, 25 billion surplus, but of that, 30 billion. Overall Vietnam trade surplus, not US only, but the trade surplus, the foreign sector has double that, and the actual domestic sector is a deficit. So there is a lot of more weakness in the domestic companies when it comes to their ability to deal with trade problems, and you're right, that is a concern.
And last week when we spoke, my prediction was supply chain shifting, using Vietnam as a processing hub for Chinese consumers. Yeah. There's another scenario that I'm keeping a keen eye on.
Localizing is what's going to happen. You think you're comfortable that regionalizing, the Asian Vietnam gets to be part of that.
Yeah, okay? Definitely. Yep. But another one which I'm keeping a keen eye on, which is not in popular media and so forth, but I find it really, really interesting. So China had the biggest hit. Vietnam has had, on a percentage basis, it looks like the second biggest hit. I would argue it's not, but that's how it looks. So, great chance for China to, work with Vietnam again on something, to show there's something. What's going to come out of that? We're going to see something.
Isn't Xi here in a week's time in Vietnam?
Yep. And from that, now this is the thing that's not in the media. So the global south is Africa, the Middle East, okay? And then you've got South America. Yeah. China has great influence in some of those countries. Vietnam is a perfect partner for many of those countries. The developed world find it hard. They can't compete on price points. They don't know how. Vietnam knows how to compete because that is how they live. The same price points, right? So
interesting.
The markets that China can't engage because those markets are nervous what America will say, Vietnam can engage those markets with China's support and without America getting upset. So I think it's a really interesting area for Vietnam to look into and grow out from.
So just in the interest of time, final thoughts from me is that I'm hopeful that there is some movement. These are the top, and they're a pure negotiating position to try to get US to get a better result, but that Vietnam doesn't have to wear 46% for too long. So I think it will be debilitating and unnecessary. And the trading countries are being impacted more than the consumption countries. Hopefully we can move the needle somewhat, and the world has shifted. So it is part of a shifted world and different world trade now that these have been announced. Liberation Day exists, so I'm hopeful that in the coming short period of time we can see some change. What are your final thoughts, Adam?
Well, I guess my final thought, which is not a summary, it's more something I found very interesting about today. So the developing economies were the hardest hit. So I'm really curious to see how the developing economies come together in this. Yeah. And the developed world will struggle a lot more than the developing world will. So, that's something that's going to play out across this year. Yeah. But once again, it's not the end. It's the beginning. And opportunities are going to arise. So if you have decent fiscal management, you're going to be okay, and you're going to come out of this well.
Yep. Well, I wouldn't necessarily want to be a US consumer right now with the likely impact as well. So there's no winners at the moment. Let's see where we can get to.
Oh yeah, sorry. Well, that would have to be. You brought up my final point then. So America was never going to tax their billionaires to get out of their debt problem. They've taxed their consumers. Yeah. America is every year their debt gets worse. If they were a company, they would have been bankrupt a long, long time ago. So they're not going to tax the owners, they're going to tax their consumers. And that's what they've done today.
Fair enough. Okay, well, let's see what happens in coming days. Let's chat again shortly, and good to talk as always, Adam.
I got a feeling we'll be chatting tomorrow and the day after, mate. All right, see you.
Most likely. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.